I'm Sam Collins. I'm an associate professor in the history department. I specialize in late ancient and early medieval history. I think this is my 99th year, or at least it feels like it, but I've been here 15 years. So the Acropolis, I mean, it means high city, right? So it's a raised hill in the center of ancient Athens, which probably housed the core of the earliest layer of Athenian occupation. But by the time you get to the classical period, it's a monumental center, right? It's a place primarily for temples, but not exclusively for temples. It's a sacred site in the middle of the mundane city where one approaches and encounters the gods. Principally Athena Parthenos, the patron god of Athens, but not just her. You'll often find in classical Greek settlements that there's an Acropolis attached to important places. Having a hill in the middle of your city provides an initial defensive advantage. That's probably the origin of those hills being important in Greek cities. But like in Athens, those prominent bits of geography often get translated into prominent bits of sacred topography as the city develops. Right in the heart of ancient Athens, right? So if you think about Athens, it has a number of parts, right? It has a port, which is some miles down the road at the Piraeus, right? And then there's a major road from the Piraeus into Athens proper, which is guarded in antiquity, at least, by a set of defensive walls. And then the inhabited part of the city of Athens sprawls around the Acropolis. I don't have a more precise reconstruction of how we think the development of the topography of Athens went for you. But you're right in the heart of the ancient city when you're on the Acropolis, just like now. Those high places in the center of ancient cities, particularly in the Greek world, are originally by origin defensive sites, and they still are, right? The Acropolis is surrounded by a wall in classical antiquity, though those walls serve a double purpose. They're not just a practical defensive measure. They're drawn sacred boundaries. Temenos is the usual word for it. You build a temenos wall around any temple site to mark off the difference between this world, the world that you and I inhabit, and then the kind of places where you would also encounter gods. So it's a sacred boundary marking the holy place out from not the holy place. And the Acropolis itself has one of these temenos boundary walls around it. Every ancient city has a religious calendar, right? So we're used to, in a monotheist world, of everyone being on the same calendar, right? There's Easter and Christmas, et cetera, in a Christian context, and you always know when those are. In the ancient world, each city had its own religious calendar, right? That you meet the gods on their appropriate days. And so the primary purpose of the Acropolis, at least in classical antiquity, is to enable that religious celebration of the gods. Again, you meet the gods at the place where they expect to be met, right? At their temple site, at the altar in front of their temple site, on the appropriate days, and you offer them sacrifice, right? You offer them a kind of honorific show of just how much you respect and honor those divinities, with the idea that in turn, those divinities will be pleased by your scrupulous performance of the expected rites, and will then in turn bring prosperity to the city, right? And anti-prosperity to the city's enemies, right? So it's about preserving the political future of Athens by making sure the gods are on side. And the way you make sure the gods are on side is you do what they expect, the sacrifice, when they expect, according to the local religious calendar, at the place that they expect, at their local temple. That we know there's a great many phases to that building, right? There's an initial pre-Parthenon, as it's usually called in the scholarly literature, which the Persians wipe out when they sack the city in 480, as the closing chapters of the Persian Wars. After that improbable victory over the Persians, right, the Athenians, now wealthy because they just beat the most powerful empire in the world, rebuild the Parthenon and the rest of the Acropolis in grand style. But then those buildings will go on to be modified further into later Greek history in the Hellenistic period, then again in the Roman period, and the Parthenon, quite, it's well known that it turns into a medieval church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And then ultimately, the Parthenon is in its semi-ruined state because it serves as a store for Turkish gunpowder, which blows up in the early modern period. As far as ancient temples go, it's in pretty good shape, right? You can still see Athena's high altar in front to one side of the Parthenon. And then you can very clearly see its outer colonnade, and you can still mark out quite clearly where the twin inner chambers were, the two cellas of the Parthenon. So there's a sculptural program, though admittedly, some of it you can see in the museum on site, and some of it you have to go to London to see. And there's a bit of an international kerfluffle over whether those sculptures, the Elgin marbles, as they're called, for the Lord Elgin who bought them under mysterious circumstances in the 18th century, that whether those marbles should be kept in London or returned to Greece. But yeah, there's so ultimately, there's a fair bit of the building still to be seen. There are a variety of sculptural programs on the Parthenon. The lowest by height portion of that architectural program are the metopes, which are these square panels depicting mythological combats. The story of the Amazons is told there, the story of the Lapiths and the Centaurs is told there, etc. And in 2011, 2012, 2 or 3 more of these metopes were recovered as part of an excavation elsewhere on the Acropolis. And the idea is that these sculptural programs, which in the Christian Middle Ages carried very little cultural weight any longer, they were reused, right, as just raw building materials and incorporated into a wall. And so that discovery was relatively recent by the standards of these things. The context of the Parthenon, right, is the Persian War, right? So in the earlier part of the 5th century, the Greek cities, right, which are politically disunited, they're independent operators, this Greek world is invaded by the Persian Empire, first by Darius and then by his son Xerxes. These are the most powerful emperors anywhere in the landscape, right? Those little Greek cities are true pipsqueaks by comparison to the mighty Persian Empire. And then, you can follow along in Herodotus, but the story goes that those Greek cities managed to put aside their many and deeply held differences. And for the moment, right, in the 480s, they managed to provide a kind of semi-unified defense against this couple of waves of Persian invasion. And although the Persian armies of Xerxes sack Athens, as I alluded to earlier, which is that sack is in 480. Ultimately, in the immediate aftermath of that sack, there are significant victories, principally the Athenian victory on the water, within sight of the Acropolis, the Battle of Salamis. And in the wake of the Battle of Salamis, and then the couple of victories that follow, the Persian Empire is defeated. And it's an unthinkable outcome, right? It's a little like, I don't know, the soccer team from your middle school beating the Brazilian national team or something like that. It's a big deal. And in the process of this, Athens goes from being a place that's about to be incorporated into an empire into the architects of an amazing victory. And so with the money that is then taken as loot from the defeated Persians, partly, the Acropolis gets rebuilt. So the rebuilding happens in the 440s and is completed in the 430s. And the rebuilding of the temple of Athena Parthenos, patron goddess of Athens, is at the heart of that. And so the building then is in that way, it's a thank offering, right? It's a thank offering for the deliverance of Athens by the gods who clearly engineered this victory, because how else would you explain it, right? And so so we should think of the Parthenon in that context. But there's one extra layer from the Persian War that I think is even more interesting, right? So after the Persian War, Athens is not only one of the architects of that victory, but they find themselves quite quickly, or they put themselves quite quickly into an imperial position inside the greater Greek world. They form what's called the Delian League. It's in theory, it's a league of Greek cities led by Athens for mutual defense in case the Persians come back, this kind of thing. But participation in the Delian League is not voluntary, it's compulsory. And to be a participant in the Delian League means you need to pay an awful lot of money from your city back to the mother city, Athens, in terms of these annual tributes. In theory, Athens is collecting this money to, fund mutual defense. In reality, this is an empire in the making, and that's the empire forcibly extracting cash from its imperial subjects. And so the Delian League is right away a site of conflict and of resentment inside the Greek world. And if you look at the Parthenon, the building itself is designed to accommodate that imperial relationship. So what you're looking at is you're looking at that outer rectangle is the podium, the raised platform that the Parthenon sits on. Mm-hmm. You'll then notice that there's an outer colonnade, right, that goes around the entire the exterior of that podium. But then inside, there are two chambers. Each one of these is called a cella, right? There's the larger chamber to the right of the slide, with an exit out onto the colonnade. And then there's a smaller chamber to the left. Now, in lots of ways, it's totally normal to have a chamber inside these temples, right? So the idea is that most temples have a single cella. That's where you put the cult statue of the god, in whose honor this temple is raised. That cella will serve then as a kind of, a yet more sacred space inside the temple. It's the place where the god is encountered in that god's statue. It's also the place where thank offerings will be given, gifts in honor of the goodwill that the god has bestowed upon the grateful citizenry, etc. But it's normal in a Greek temple building to have a single cella. And the Parthenon is unusual because it has a second cella. So that second cella, the smaller one on the west side of the Parthenon, that's a treasury. That's the place where every year during the Greater Panathenaia, which is the major festival of Athena during the liturgical year of the city of Athens, that's the place where all of those member states of the Delian League had to come and deposit the treasure that Athens was forcibly extracting from them in this process of empire building. And so in that way, right, this building is a symbol of Athens, a symbol and a thank offering of that victory over the Persians, but then also a symbol of the new empire that Athens has created for itself out of the wake of that victory. And so in that way, it's a really Athenian triumphalist place. But I think, this is, Mary Beard's point about this, and she ought to know, right, that if you put yourself in the position of one of those colonial members of the Delian League from one of those other cities in Greece that's now under the thumb of Athens and has to annually pay this exorbitant tribute to Athens in order to, keep the Athenians from coming in their ships with their spears, et cetera, and coming to look for you, that the Parthenon is a symbol then of your oppression, and particularly, right, that place where you meet the god and the place where you pay money to the servants of the god in such close proximity to each other. You can see where this is also a hated symbol of that kind of political aggression, right? Mm-hmm. So the Parthenon has this kind of double context. It's both about victory, and then it's also about empire building. This is a reconstruction, and I think a pretty good one, of the whole complex in action during the Greater Panathenaia. So again, Athens has a religious calendar where the various gods who are honored in the city are honored on different portions of that calendar. There are a number of times where one honors the goddess Athena, and the Greater Panathenaia is the largest of those festivals. So when you encounter an ancient divinity, you don't encounter that ancient divinity as an individual, right? Again, working from a Christian context, we're so often used to thinking of the individual believer and then the mysteries of the divine as the kind of encounter that's happening there. In a Greek setting, right, you always encounter in groups, right? And that group might be your whole city. It might be your family. It might be those other kinds of professional or religious groupings that you belong to. But the idea is that everybody is expected to participate as a collective whole, right? And so here at the Greater Panathenaia, the citizens of Athens are turning out to play their part in honoring the goddess Athena. And so what you're looking at here is you're looking at the sacred space elements that I alluded to earlier. As people progress up that grand ramp or staircase, right, they're passing through a gateway, and that's passing through the temenos wall. They're moving from the mundane world into this world where the presence of the gods is possible to encounter. Inside that gateway, there are there are pools for ritual washing of the hands, right? You want to be clean when you cross the temenos wall. But there are other kinds of, rules about how and under what circumstances you can enter here, et cetera. And once you're up on the Acropolis proper, you'll see the Parthenon in the background at the top right. The trick with this is that normally the high altar of a god is directly in front of the temple dedicated to that god. And the idea there is that on a festival day, when the door to the cella is open, the god can inhabit the cult statue and then see the sacrificial activity happening on the altar directly outside. But the high altar to Athena, the great altar to Athena, isn't in front of the Parthenon. It's sort of to the rear and off to one side. You can see it in the background in this reconstruction with the flames burning and the smoke rising, because sacrifice day is part of the greater Panathenaia. For the Parthenon, the altar is out of place because it's honoring the place where the altar always has been. That altar would have been in front of the older temple to the Athena, the pre-Parthenon that the Persians trashed. And when the Parthenon is rebuilt after the victory over the Persians, there's not enough room on the old site. And so the Parthenon is moved to its current setting in its larger format, but they keep the tradition of the ancient altar, right? But the idea being, of course, that, part of what the gods expect is they expect things to be done as it's always been done. And so having the altar in the same site is a pious continuity of worship in the same place that our fathers and grandfathers and their grandfathers, et cetera, had encountered the goddess. Okay. So, so these are the metapes that I alluded to earlier, right? So there are several registers that around the Parthenon above the column tops, and the frieze of the metapes is it's the lowest, the closest to the ground of that. And what these are, right, is there are a series of these square panels carved with mythological scenes, but the mythological scenes are probably not either randomly or accidentally chosen, but rather they have some ideological content that goes along with those stories I was just telling you about victory over the Persians and then subsequent imperial activity. And so the one that I'm highlighting here, this is the metapes, the battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. And so just to refresh your memory about that myth, right? So the Lapiths are, there are mythological people who lived north of Athens, right, in Thessaly. And so in a certain way, they're a kind of stand-in for ancient Athens, at least as far as the building goes here, right? They're these ancient Greeks of the past. And the Lapiths are, they're us, right? They are living their Greek civilized life in ancient Thessaly, abiding by rules and generally being good people. But they have as their neighbors the Centaurs, and the Centaurs are wild men, right? They're unpredictable. There's no rules that could possibly contain them. They're dangerous and fickle and the rest of it. The Lapiths make the mistake of inviting the Centaurs to a feast, right? Trying to be good neighbors in that way. And you know what happens, right? It turns into a disaster. The Centaurs rebel, there's a fight. And what you're looking at here are these in these series of metapes, which occupied one of the sides of this layer, the Parthenon frieze. You're looking at these representations of the battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. So in this scene, this is a pretty well-preserved one. That is Lapith man on the ground, right? Being run over by a Centaur. You'll notice that Lapith man is getting a blow in, right? His arm is raised and he's probably stabbing the Centaur in the side. The Centaur's got Lapith man by the hair, and his missing arm almost assuredly carried a weapon. And again, do what you will with here. This is a perfectly nice story. It's an important part of the mythological corpus. And so, of course, it's appropriate for a building. But then when you pick it apart a little bit, right, you'll notice that this is a battle between the civilized and the barbaric. And I don't know how much Herodotus you've read, but Herodotus's retelling of the Persian Wars is a story that's exactly that. It's set in these very high relief, right? The Greeks represent civilization, and the Persians are the archetypical Eastern barbarians, right? And so in that way, the battle between the Lapis and the Centaurs can get read as a, a mythological riff on the war that Athens just won. But if you look at it a little further, right, and you delve into your Thucydides now, who talks an awful lot about the Delian League, the demands the Athenians made on their imperial subjects, and the resentment that those demands generated. The Athenian rhetoric around the Delian League is that we Athenians are the most civilized of Greeks. The phrase that gets used by Pericles in a famous speech in Thucydides is that we are the school of Hellas, right? We Athenians are going to show you other Greeks how to appropriately be Greeks, right? And that your participation, compelled in the Delian League, very expensive, is part of this civilizing mission of Athens against their barbarian neighbors, right? And so then the battle between the Lapis and the Centaurs on this building takes on an imperialist voice, right? And it talks again about the Athenian self-righteousness and the Athenian use of that kind of barbarians versus civilized way of dividing the world as a justification for why their oppressive empire, of course, is perfectly okay. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that the Parthenon is anything but a kind of neutral statement in its moment, and it's best seen in these sort of contexts about the war and about the aftermath of the war.